My eyes opened to a ceiling that wasn't mine. Silk sheets clung to my body, and beside me lay an alpha whose face was so devastatingly handsome that my breath caught in my throat. I had become a prisoner of my own mistake. What had happened? Last night I'd only gone to my friend's engagement party, nothing more than a casual celebration where I thought I'd be safe. But someone had slipped something into my drink. My mind had gone foggy and distant, and now I was here in a stranger's bed with no memory of how I'd gotten here. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might break through, and my hands trembled as I tried to piece together the fragments of last night. Suddenly he turned over and his deep brown eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me freeze. He was Edward Kane, the Edward Kane, CEO of Kane Industries, a man whose name dominated business headlines and society pages alike. And now he had become my biggest problem, the catalyst for a disaster I couldn't have predicted even in my worst nightmares. "Who are you?" His voice was cold, clinical almost, though his eyes held a flicker of confusion that mirrored my own terror. "I'm leaving right now." My voice shook so badly I barely recognized it as my own. I scrambled to gather my clothes scattered across the floor, my omega instinct screaming at me to run as fast as possible. But running wouldn't change what had already happened. The damage was done. My omega scent still lingered in the room like damning evidence, and I knew Edward had already registered it, already categorized me in his mind. I fled that hotel room without looking back, my clothes barely straightened, my dignity in tatters. The morning air hit my face like a slap of reality, and I wanted nothing more than to pretend this had never happened. But fate had other plans for me. Plans I wouldn't understand until 3 days later when my entire world came crashing down around my ears. My family summoned me home with an urgency that made my stomach twist into knots. The moment I walked through the door and saw my father's face, I knew something terrible was waiting for me. His expression was carved from stone, cold and unforgiving in a way I'd never seen before. Without a word he threw an envelope at me and it landed at my feet like a bomb waiting to explode. "What is this, Patrick?" His voice cut through the air with razor-sharp precision. My hands shook as I bent to pick it up, my fingers fumbling with the flap. Inside were photographs, clear, undeniable photographs of me and Edward outside that hotel, captured in a moment that looked far more intimate than I remembered. Someone had been watching us, documenting our encounter, and now this evidence threatened to destroy everything. The papers slipped from my trembling fingers and scattered across the floor like accusations. I was an omega, unmarked and unbonded, and I had been seen with an unmated alpha of Edward Kane's caliber. In our world, this wasn't just scandalous, it was a catastrophe waiting to unfold. The family's reputation is at stake now. My father continued, his tone brooking no argument. "You will marry him and you will do it quickly before this scandal spreads any further." "I don't even know him." The protest burst from my lips before I could stop it, desperate and futile. "This isn't fair. I can't marry someone I've never even spoken to properly. I don't care about fair. This wedding will happen whether you agree or not. Either you marry Edward Kane and salvage our family name, or you leave this house and never come back. The choice is yours. But choose wisely because I won't offer this option again." The ultimatum hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I looked at my father's implacable face, then at my mother standing silently in the corner with tears streaming down her cheeks, and I realized I had no real choice at all. My family's honor had been built over generations, and I was expected to sacrifice my own happiness to preserve it. The walls seemed to close in around me as I understood the trap I'd fallen into. 2 days later, after hurried negotiations between our families and Edward's corporate lawyers, I found myself standing beside him in a courthouse. There was no joy, no celebration, no friends or flowers or any of the things a wedding should have. Just two people binding their lives together on paper while a judge droned through legal formalities that sounded more like a business contract than a marriage ceremony. And that's how I became Edward Kane's omega. Through force, through circumstance, through a one-night stand that I couldn't even properly remember. Not through love, not through choice, but through the cold machinery of social obligation and family pressure. As I signed my name on the marriage certificate, I felt like I was signing away my freedom, my future, my very identity. Edward didn't look at me once during the entire ceremony. His jaw was set in a hard line, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the courtroom walls, as if by not acknowledging my presence he could pretend this wasn't really happening. When the judge pronounced us married, there was no kiss, no embrace, no acknowledgement of the bond we'd supposedly just formed. He simply turned and walked out, leaving me to follow in his wake like an afterthought. Outside the courthouse, as rain began to fall in a gray drizzle that matched my mood perfectly, Edward finally spoke to me for the second time in my life. "Move your things to my penthouse tomorrow. My driver has the address and will arrange transportation for you." Then he climbed into his sleek black car and drove away without another word, leaving me standing on the courthouse steps in the rain, legally his spouse but feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my entire life. I watched his taillights disappear into traffic and wondered what kind of prison I'd just walked into willingly. This was supposed to be marriage, but it felt more like a sentence, one I'd have to serve for the rest of my life unless something changed dramatically. My omega instincts cried out for the bond that should exist between mates, but my logical mind knew that Edward saw me as nothing more than an inconvenient obligation that had been forced upon him. As I finally called a car to take me back to my soon-to-be former home, I placed one hand over my stomach in an unconscious gesture of protection. I didn't know it yet, but something was already growing inside me, a consequence of that one forgotten night that would change everything all over again. The rain fell harder and I let it wash over me, hoping it might cleanse away the confusion and fear that threatened to drown me from within. Tomorrow I would move into Edward's penthouse and begin this strange new life as his unwanted omega. But tonight, I would allow myself one last moment of grief for the future I'd lost and the freedom I'd never get back. The penthouse was exactly what I'd expected from someone like Edward. Massive, modern, and completely devoid of warmth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city skyline, but the space felt more like a showroom than a home. All sharp angles and cold surfaces that reflected my own isolation back at me. I stood in the entrance with my suitcases, feeling smaller and more out of place with every passing second. A staff member appeared as if summoned by my presence, an older woman with kind eyes but a professional distance that made it clear she wouldn't be offering emotional support. "Mr. Kane has instructed me to show you to your room," she said politely, gesturing toward a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. My room, not our room. The distinction was deliberate and painful, a physical manifestation of the emotional distance Edward intended to maintain between us. I followed her through the pristine hallway, our footsteps echoing against marble floors that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. She opened a door to reveal a beautifully appointed bedroom, comfortable, well-designed, but undeniably separate from the master suite at the opposite end of the penthouse. "Mr. Kane's quarters are down that corridor," she explained, pointing in the other direction. "He values his privacy and prefers not to be disturbed when he's home. Meals are served in the dining room at 8, 1 and 7 unless other arrangements are requested." She delivered these instructions like house rules at a hotel, which I supposed wasn't far from the truth. This wasn't a home, it was a gilded cage dressed up as luxury living. After she left, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried not to think about how thoroughly my life had been dismantled and reorganized without my input. Edward came home late that evening, long after dinner had been cleared away. I heard the front door open and his footsteps moving through the penthouse, and my omega instincts immediately responded to his alpha presence. His pheromones were strong, commanding, and they called to something deep within me that I desperately wanted to ignore. I stepped out of my room, thinking perhaps we could talk, perhaps establish some kind of understanding between us. But he walked straight past me toward his bedroom as if I were invisible, his phone pressed to his ear as he conducted business even at this late hour. The door to his suite closed with a decisive click that sounded like a rejection, and I was left standing alone in the hallway feeling more foolish than ever for hoping things might be different. This became our pattern. Edward avoided me with an expertise that suggested he'd had plenty of practice keeping people at arm's length. We moved through the penthouse like ghosts, occupying separate planes of existence, occasionally glimpsing each other but never truly connecting. The staff maintained the illusion that this was normal, that all married couples lived in such careful isolation. I tried to build some kind of routine for myself. Mornings I spent reading or attempting to find online work that might give me some sense of purpose. Afternoons stretched on endlessly as I wandered the empty penthouse or sat by the windows watching the city below carry on with life. Evenings brought the faint hope that Edward might come home early, that we might share a meal or a conversation, but that hope was consistently disappointed. One morning, desperate for any kind of human interaction, I forced myself to wake early and go to the dining room for breakfast. Edward was already there, immaculately dressed in one of his signature dark suits, his attention focused on the tablet beside his coffee cup. I poured myself juice with trembling hands and sat down across from him, the table suddenly feeling as wide as an ocean. "Edward," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. Could we maybe talk sometime, about us, about this situation?" He didn't even glance up from his tablet. "This is an arrangement, Patrick. Nothing more complicated than that. You live your life however you choose, and I'll live mine. The only requirement is that we present a united front to the public when necessary." His words were delivered with such casual indifference that they hurt more than outright cruelty would have. At least cruelty would have indicated he felt something, even if it was negative. This apathy was worse because it meant I simply didn't matter enough to warrant any emotional investment whatsoever. "So that's it?" I pressed, unable to stop myself despite knowing it was futile. "We're just roommates who happen to share a last name? That's an accurate assessment," he replied, finally looking up with those cold brown eyes that revealed nothing. "I didn't ask for this marriage any more than you did. Let's not pretend there's anything deeper here than mutual obligation." Something inside me cracked at that moment. Some last fragile hope that maybe we could build something real from these broken pieces. I wanted to scream at him, to demand that he at least acknowledge the unfairness of our situation. But what would be the point? Edward had already made his position crystal clear. I retreated to my room and didn't emerge for the rest of the day. Through the walls I could hear him moving about the penthouse later, conducting phone calls and living his life as if I didn't exist. My omega instincts were in turmoil, confused by the presence of an alpha who refused to fulfill any of the traditional protective roles that should have come naturally to him. The following week brought a new torture when I overheard his assistant scheduling a dinner meeting. I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping. The assistant had called while I was in the kitchen, and her voice carried clearly through the open space. "Yes, Mr. Kane will meet Mr. Vincent Ashford at Les Bernardines at 8 tomorrow evening. He's requested the private dining room as usual." Vincent Ashford. Another alpha, and according to the society pages I'd nervously browsed, Edward's former lover before family pressure and business considerations had forced them apart. They were still meeting secretly, still maintaining whatever connection they'd shared, while I existed as nothing more than a legal inconvenience. The knowledge sat in my stomach like lead. I had no claim on Edward's affections, no right to feel betrayed by this revelation. Yet the pain was real and sharp anyway. My omega biology was trying to bond with an alpha who not only rejected me but actively maintained ties to someone else, someone he presumably actually cared about. That night, I lay in my separate bedroom and wondered how long I could sustain this existence. How many days of being ignored, how many nights of sleeping alone while married, how many reminders that I was unwanted could I endure before something inside me broke completely. My hand unconsciously moved to my stomach, though I didn't understand why the gesture felt so natural, so protective. My body was changing in ways I hadn't yet recognized, preparing for a revelation that would explode our careful pretense of civilized distance. But for now I was simply a trapped omega in a loveless marriage, counting the hours until anything changed. 2 months crawled by in that sterile penthouse, each day bleeding into the next in an endless cycle of avoidance and loneliness. I'd almost convinced myself that this was sustainable, that I could live indefinitely as Edward's invisible spouse, existing in the margins of his life, without complaint or expectation. But then my body betrayed me in a way I'd never anticipated, and everything shifted on its axis once again. It started with dizziness. I'd wake up and the room would tilt alarmingly, forcing me to grip the bed frame until the world stabilized. Then came the nausea, sudden and overwhelming, sending me rushing to the bathroom at odd hours with my stomach rebelling against me. I told myself it was stress, that living in emotional isolation was taking a physical toll, and I tried to push through it with sheer determination. But my omega scent began changing too. becoming sweeter and more intense in a way that I couldn't explain or control. The staff started looking at me strangely, their expressions knowing in a way that made me uncomfortable. And when my heat cycle failed to arrive on schedule, genuine fear crept into my awareness. Because I understood what these symptoms might mean even as I desperately tried to deny the possibility. I couldn't be pregnant. That one night was a blur of forgotten moments. And Edward and I certainly hadn't been intimate since our forced marriage. But Omega biology didn't care about my protests or my desire to remain in denial. It operated according to its own rules, and those rules were now screaming at me to face reality. I waited until Edward left for the office before slipping out of the penthouse. The clinic was discreet, the kind of place where people went when they needed privacy more than comfort. The doctor was professional and kind, but her congratulations felt like a death sentence rather than good news as she handed me the test results that confirmed what I'd been dreading. "You're approximately 6 weeks along, Mr. Kane. Congratulations on your pregnancy." 6 weeks. The timeline matched perfectly with that night, with the encounter I couldn't remember but whose consequences were now undeniable. My fingers trembled so badly that I nearly dropped the paperwork, my vision blurring as tears I'd been holding back for months finally spilled over. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. I was carrying Edward's child, a pup conceived in circumstances neither of us had chosen, and I had no idea how to tell him or what his reaction would be. Would he accuse me of trapping him even more thoroughly than I already had? Would he demand I terminate the pregnancy to avoid further complications in his carefully controlled life? The uncertainty was almost worse than any definitive answer could have been. I returned to the penthouse in a daze, clutching the medical report like evidence at a trial. The space felt different somehow, more oppressive now that I knew I was bringing another life into this cold environment. How could I raise a child here in this emotional wasteland where even basic human warmth was rationed? Edward wasn't home, which was typical for the middle of the afternoon. I paced the living room for hours, rehearsing different ways to break the news and discarding each one as inadequate. There was no good way to tell someone that your one-night stand had resulted in a permanent connection neither of you wanted, especially when that someone had made it abundantly clear that you barely registered in their awareness. When I finally heard his key in the lock late that evening, my heart launched itself into my throat. He walked in looking exhausted, his tie loosened and his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. For a moment, seeing him vulnerable like that, I almost lost my nerve completely. "Edward, we need to talk." My voice came out stronger than I'd expected, surprising both of us. He glanced up from his phone with obvious irritation creasing his forehead. "Can this wait until tomorrow, Patrick? It's been an extremely long day and I'm not in the mood for discussions." "No, it really can't wait." I stepped in front of him, blocking his path to his bedroom sanctuary. "This is important, probably the most important conversation we're going to have." Something in my tone must have penetrated his exhaustion because he actually focused on me properly for the first time in weeks. His alpha instincts seemed to register that something was wrong, that I was genuinely distressed rather than simply seeking attention. He set his briefcase down slowly, his full attention now on me in a way that was both gratifying and terrifying. I thrust the medical report toward him before I could lose my courage entirely. "I'm pregnant, 6 weeks along. It's from that night. The night that started all of this." Edward took the papers from my shaking hands and read them with an expression I couldn't interpret. The silence stretched between us, taut and unbearable, as he processed the information. I watched emotions flicker across his face too quickly to identify. Shock, confusion, and something that might have been anger or might have been fear. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes had gone cold in a way that made my blood freeze in my veins. "You're telling me this is real? That you're actually pregnant with my child?" "Yes," I whispered, my throat suddenly tight with unshed tears. "I know this complicates everything even more. But it's the truth. I'm going to have your baby whether either of us planned for it or not." The medical report slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor between us, a physical representation of the chasm that seemed to be opening wider with every passing second. Edward's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides, and I realized with dawning horror that his reaction was not going to be supportive or understanding. "This is convenient timing, isn't it?" His voice was sharp enough to cut. "First you somehow end up in my bed, then our families force a marriage, And now suddenly you're pregnant? You'll have to forgive me if I find the sequence of events suspiciously orchestrated. The accusation hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. You think I planned this? That I wanted any of this? My voice rose despite my attempts to control it. I can barely remember that night. Someone drugged my drink, and I woke up next to you with no memory of how I got there. Do you really believe I orchestrated being photographed, being forced into marriage, being trapped in this nightmare? People do desperate things when they want to secure their future. Edward shot back, his alpha dominance rolling off him in waves that made my omega instincts cower. Trapping a wealthy alpha with a pregnancy is one of the oldest tricks in existence. I expected better even from someone in your situation. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and furious, as the last shred of hope I'd been clinging to disintegrated completely. I don't want your money. I don't want this marriage, and I certainly didn't want to be standing here begging for even a shred of human decency from someone who clearly has none to spare. Edward turned away from me, his shoulders rigid with tension. I need time to think about this, to verify the information and consider my options. Don't expect any decisions or commitments from me tonight. He walked to his bedroom and closed the door, leaving me alone in the living room with his rejection still echoing in the air. I sank onto the couch, my hands instinctively moving to protect my stomach, and let myself break down completely. This child growing inside me deserved better than this, better than a father who didn't believe in their existence, better than an omega parent who couldn't provide stability or love. But for now, we were trapped together in this beautiful prison, waiting for whatever came next. The morning after my confession brought no relief, only a suffocating silence that pressed against my chest like a physical weight. Edward had disappeared into his bedroom without another word, leaving me curled on the couch with my arms wrapped protectively around my still flat stomach. I must have dozed off eventually because when I woke, sunlight was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows and the penthouse felt emptier than ever. I found a note on the kitchen counter, his assistant's precise handwriting informing me that Edward had left for an early meeting and wouldn't return until evening. The coward was avoiding me, buying himself time to formulate whatever cold response he'd eventually deliver. My hands shook as I crumpled the paper, anger finally breaking through the numbness that had sustained me through the night. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I tried to distract myself with television, with books, with anything that might keep my mind from spiraling into worst-case scenarios. But my omega instincts were in chaos, confused by an alpha who should have been protective but instead felt like a threat. The baby, our pup, deserved better than this uncertainty, this emotional minefield I'd brought them into. When Edward finally walked through the door that evening, his expression was carved from granite. Gone was even the pretense of civility we'd maintained during our months of careful avoidance. Now there was only barely contained fury radiating from every line of his body, his alpha dominance so overwhelming that I instinctively took a step backward. We need to finish our conversation from last night, he announced, his voice deadly calm in a way that was somehow worse than shouting would have been. I thought we already did, I managed, though my voice wavered traitorously. You made your position quite clear when you accused me of trapping you. Edward's jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Did you really think I'd just accept this without questions? That I'd blindly trust that this pregnancy is legitimate and not some elaborate scheme you've been planning since that first night? The accusation hit me like a slap, stealing my breath. You genuinely believe I orchestrated everything? That I somehow arranged to be drugged, photographed with you, forced into marriage by my own family, all as part of some master plan to get pregnant? Stranger things have happened when money and status are involved. He shot back, moving closer with predatory grace that made my omega instincts scream conflicting warnings. You wouldn't be the first person to see an opportunity and seize it, consequences be damned. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing how deeply his words were cutting me. If you knew anything about me at all, you'd know that I never wanted any of this. I had my own life, my own plans before that night destroyed everything. Then prove it, Edward challenged, his eyes blazing with an intensity that pinned me in place. Take a paternity test. Let's establish beyond doubt that this child is actually mine and not some convenient fiction you're using to cement your position in my life. The suggestion shouldn't have hurt as much as it did. It was logical, even reasonable given our circumstances. But the implication behind it, the assumption that I was capable of such calculated deception, felt like he was questioning my very character. My hand moved unconsciously to my stomach, a protective gesture that had become instinctive over the past day. "Fine," I whispered, my voice breaking despite my best efforts. "We'll do whatever tests you want, but when they prove I'm telling the truth, don't expect me to forgive how you've treated me through all of this." Something flickered in Edward's eyes. Regret maybe, or recognition of how far he'd pushed me, but it vanished before I could identify it with certainty. He turned away, his shoulders rigid with tension that suggested this confrontation was costing him more than his cold exterior revealed. "My doctor will arrange everything," he said to the windows rather than to me. "Until then, I think it's best if we maintain even more distance than we have been. I'll be staying at my downtown office apartment for the next 2 weeks while I'm sorting through some business complications." The words landed like a physical blow. He was leaving, running away from the mess we'd created, abandoning me to deal with the pregnancy alone while he hid behind work obligations and wounded pride. My omega biology recoiled at the rejection from my alpha, even though my logical mind knew his absence might actually be a relief. "Of course you are," I said bitterly, finally letting some of my anger show. "Why deal with uncomfortable situations when you can just throw money at them and disappear? That's been your strategy since the beginning, hasn't it? Ignore the inconvenient omega you were forced to marry and maybe he'll just fade into the background like he was never there at all." Edward flinched at that, actually flinched, and for a moment I thought he might respond with something real, something honest. But he simply gathered his briefcase and headed toward his bedroom, presumably to pack whatever he needed for his extended escape. I stood frozen in the living room, listening to drawers opening and closing, the sound of a suitcase being zipped. When he emerged 20 minutes later, he looked through me rather than at me, as if I'd already become invisible. "My assistant will ensure you have everything you need while I'm gone," he said mechanically. "If there are any medical emergencies, contact her and she'll arrange appropriate care." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the suddenly cavernous penthouse. I sank onto the couch, my hands cradling my stomach, and finally let myself cry. Not delicate tears, but ugly, wrenching sobs that shook my entire body and left me gasping for air. The days that followed were some of the loneliest of my life. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum without even Edward's distant presence to break up the emptiness. My body continued changing, my omega scent growing sweeter and more intense, my appetite increasing in ways that would have been alarming if I hadn't known the cause. But emotionally, I was barely holding myself together. I found myself talking to the baby sometimes, one hand resting on my stomach as I shared fears and hopes with someone who couldn't possibly understand yet. "Your father is terrified," I whispered one evening as the cities flickered to life below. "I think maybe I am too. But I promise you, little one, that no matter what happens between us, you'll always be loved, always be wanted." On the 8th day of Edward's absence, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, tired of dealing with Edward's various assistants and their impersonal efficiency. But something made me swipe to accept, and the voice that greeted me sent ice through my veins. "Patrick? This is Vincent Ashford. I think it's time we had a conversation about Edward and what your future with him really looks like." My heart hammered against my ribs as Vincent continued, his tone casual but carrying an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite identify. "I know you're pregnant," Edward told me, "and I think you deserve to understand some things about the man you've married, things that might influence the decisions you're about to make." "Why would you want to help me?" I asked suspiciously, my free hand moving protectively over my stomach. "Help might be too strong a word," Vincent replied smoothly. "Let's call it providing perspective. Meet me tomorrow afternoon at Blue Moon Cafe. 3 o'clock. Come alone. What you do with the information I share will be entirely up to you." The call ended before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone with a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity churning in my gut. This felt like a trap, like walking into a situation that could only make everything worse. But I was drowning in isolation and uncertainty, and Vincent was offering answers about the alpha who'd abandoned me. Against every instinct screaming that this was a terrible idea, I knew I would go. Blue Moon Cafe occupied a corner of the arts district, all exposed brick and ambient lighting designed for intimate conversations. I arrived 10 minutes early, my nerves stretched so thin I thought they might snap. Vincent was already there, occupying a corner booth with the casual confidence of someone who'd never questioned their place in the world. He was objectively handsome in the way alphas often were: sharp features, broad shoulders, an air of barely contained power. But where Edward's presence made my omega instincts respond with confused longing, Vincent triggered only wariness. This was someone dangerous, someone who knew how to wield information like a weapon. "Thank you for coming," he said as I slid into the booth across from him, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I wasn't certain you would." "I'm here for answers, not pleasantries," I replied, keeping my tone neutral despite the anxiety coiling in my chest. "You said you had information about Edward that I should know." Vincent signaled the waitress for 2 coffees before leaning back and studying me with unsettling intensity. "You really don't know what you've walked into, do you? You think this pregnancy changes things? That it gives you some kind of leverage or security in Edward's life?" "I don't think anything," I shot back, my hand moving unconsciously to my stomach. "I'm simply dealing with the reality of my situation as best I can." "Then let me illuminate that reality for you," Vincent said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "Edward and I were together for 3 years before family obligations and business pressures forced him to end our relationship. We understood each other, shared values and goals that transcended the superficial connections most people settle for." Each word felt designed to hurt, to emphasize how much more legitimate Vincent's claim to Edward was compared to my accidental intrusion. I forced myself to maintain eye contact, refusing to show how effectively his words were landing. "If you were so perfect together, why did he agree to marry me?" I challenged, though my voice lacked conviction. Vincent's smile turned pitying. "Because Edward has always prioritized duty over personal happiness. His family needed this alliance with yours for business reasons. I won't bore you with. The marriage was strategic. Nothing personal. You just happened to be the convenient omega who fell into his bed at exactly the wrong moment." The casual cruelty of that assessment stole my breath. "Then why are you telling me this? What do you gain from ensuring I understand how unwanted I am?" "Because I don't enjoy watching someone suffer under false hope," Vincent replied, and for the first time there was something almost genuine in his expression. "Edward will never love you, Patrick. He's incapable of it. Not because you're inadequate, but because his heart belongs to someone else. To me, we still see each other regularly, still share the connection that marriage vows to a stranger couldn't possibly break." Tears threatened, but I blinked them back furiously. "You're still sleeping together." It wasn't a question, but Vincent nodded anyway. "We're discreet about it. Naturally. Edward values his reputation too much to risk scandal. But yes, what we have continues despite the inconvenient legal entanglement he's found himself in." My world tilted on its axis as the implications crashed over me. Edward wasn't just emotionally distant. He was actively maintaining his previous relationship, treating our marriage as nothing more than a legal formality he had to navigate around. And Vincent was right. I'd been clinging to the delusion that the pregnancy might somehow bridge the gap between us, might make Edward see me as something more than an obligation. "Why are you really here?" I asked again, my voice hollow. "Just to twist the knife?" Vincent leaned forward, his expression shifting into something almost businesslike. "I'm here to offer you an exit strategy. Leave Edward, file for divorce, and take a generous settlement that will ensure you and the child are financially secure. I'll personally guarantee the terms are favorable, that you'll never have to worry about money or stability." "In exchange for what?" I demanded, because nothing came without strings attached in this world. "In exchange for giving Edward back his life," Vincent said simply. "Let him fulfill his obligations to his family's business alliances without the complication of an unwanted spouse and child. You'd be doing everyone a favor, really. Edward gets his freedom, you get financial security, and the child grows up without the toxicity of a loveless marriage poisoning the household." It was logical, even compassionate in its own twisted way. Vincent was offering me an escape from a situation that had brought nothing but pain since that first morning I'd woken in Edward's bed. Any rational person would have jumped at the opportunity to exit gracefully with their dignity and future intact. But as I sat there with Vincent's calculating gaze fixed on me, something inside me rebelled against the neat solution he was presenting. This child growing in my body deserved more than to be written off as an inconvenience, more than to grow up knowing their father had paid them off rather than claimed them. I need to think about it, I finally said, standing on shaky legs. This isn't a decision I can make impulsively. Vincent's expression revealed nothing as he nodded. Of course. Take whatever time you need. But Patrick, don't fool yourself into believing this story has a happy ending where Edward suddenly falls in love with you. That's not how this works. The sooner you accept reality, the less painful the inevitable conclusion will be. I fled the cafe without responding, my mind spinning with everything Vincent had revealed. The walk back to the penthouse felt endless, each step weighted with the burden of knowledge I couldn't unlearn. Edward didn't just see me as an obligation. He was actively avoiding that obligation by maintaining his relationship with someone else. When I finally reached the penthouse, the last person I expected to see was Edward himself, standing in the living room with his travel bag at his feet. He looked exhausted, shadows under his eyes suggesting he'd been sleeping as poorly as I had, but there was something different in his expression, something that might have been uncertainty or possibly guilt. "You're back early," I said carefully, still processing everything Vincent had shared. "We need to talk," Edward replied, and for the first time since this nightmare began, his voice carried actual emotion instead of cold detachment. "I've been doing a lot of thinking while I was away. And did you send Vincent to meet with me?" I interrupted, suddenly unable to contain the question burning in my chest. "Was that your way of pushing me toward divorce without having to do the dirty work yourself?" Edward's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine shock. "What are you talking about? I haven't spoken to Vincent about you beyond mentioning the pregnancy in passing." "Why would he?" He stopped mid-sentence, his expression darkening with realization. "He contacted you? What did he say?" "That you're still together?" I said flatly, watching his face for confirmation or denial. "That this marriage means nothing, that I should take a settlement and disappear so you can reclaim the life you actually want." Was he lying? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know even before Edward opened his mouth. Edward's face cycled through emotions too quickly to track. Surprise, anger, guilt, and something that might have been panic. He took a step toward me, then stopped himself as if uncertain whether he had the right to close the distance between us. "Vincent had no business contacting you," he said finally, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "Whatever he told you, whatever twisted version of events he presented, you need to understand that he's been trying to manipulate this situation from the beginning." "So you're denying that you've been seeing him?" I pressed, needing to hear him say explicitly one way or another. "That you've been maintaining your relationship with him while treating me like an unwelcome houseguest in my own marriage." Edward ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd never seen from him before. "It's more complicated than that." "Then uncomplicate it," I demanded, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "I'm tired of half-truths and strategic omissions. If you want any chance of salvaging this disaster, you're going to tell me the truth right now." He moved to the windows, his back to me as he stared out at the city lights beginning to flicker on in the dusk. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Vincent and I were together for years. What we had was real, or at least I thought it was. But our families had business interests that required certain alliances, and continuing our relationship would have jeopardized those arrangements. So you broke up for business reasons," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the pain those words caused. "We agreed to end the romantic relationship," Edward corrected, still not turning around. "But Vincent never actually let go. He kept calling, kept suggesting we meet to discuss old times or mutual acquaintances. I should have cut him off completely, but He stopped, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I was weak. I let him maintain contact because part of me wasn't ready to completely close that chapter." "Have you slept with him since we got married?" The question tore out of me before I could consider whether I actually wanted to know the answer. Edward finally turned to face me, and the raw honesty in his expression made my breath catch. "No. I haven't touched him or anyone else since that night with you," despite what Vincent might have implied. "But I won't lie and say I haven't thought about it, haven't wondered if walking away from what Vincent and I had was the biggest mistake of my life. The admission should have destroyed me, but instead it felt like the first genuine thing Edward had said to me since this entire nightmare began. At least he was being honest. Finally treating me like someone deserving of truth rather than carefully managed information. "Why did you come back early?" I asked, changing the subject before the pain of his confession could completely overwhelm me. "You were supposed to be gone for 2 weeks. Edward crossed the space between us, stopping just close enough that I could feel his alpha presence without him actually touching me. "Because I couldn't stay away. I thought putting distance between us would make everything clearer, would help me figure out what I wanted and how to move forward. But all it did was make me realize that running away was exactly the wrong approach." "Vincent said you'd never love me," I whispered, hating how vulnerable the words made me sound. "That your heart belongs to him and always will." "Vincent doesn't know everything," Edward replied, his hand rising as if to touch my face before dropping back to his side. "When you showed me that pregnancy test, my first instinct was terror. Not because I didn't believe you or thought you were trying to trap me, but because it made everything real in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't just a marriage on paper, it was an actual life we'd created together. A person who would exist because of one night neither of us can properly remember." "That doesn't answer my question," I pointed out, even though my omega instincts were practically begging me to move closer to him, to accept whatever comfort his presence might offer. "I don't know if I can love you the way you deserve," Edward admitted, and the honesty of that confession hurt more than any of Vincent's calculated cruelty. "I don't know if I'm capable of being the alpha you need, the partner you should have had if circumstances had been different, but I want to try. These past 2 weeks without you, even though we've barely interacted since the wedding, made me realize that you've become more important to me than I was willing to admit. I can't build a life on uncertainty," I said, though my resolve was weakening with every word he spoke. "This baby deserves stability, deserves parents who are committed to making things work rather than just going through the motions." "Then let me prove it to you," Edward said urgently, finally closing the distance between us and taking both my hands in his. "Give me a chance to show you that I can be better than I have been. I'll cut Vincent out completely. I'll attend every doctor's appointment. I'll learn how to be present instead of hiding behind work and emotional distance." "Why should I believe you?" I challenged, even as tears started streaming down my face. "You've given me no reason to trust that you won't change your mind again tomorrow or next week, when things get difficult." Edward cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away my tears. "Because for the first time since that morning, I woke up next to you. I'm not running away. I'm standing here telling you that I want to try, that I want to build something real with you and our child. That has to count for something." We stood frozen in that moment, my omega instincts warring with my logical mind about whether to trust this sudden shift in his attitude. But looking into Edward's eyes, I saw something I'd never seen before: genuine vulnerability, real fear that I might reject him the way he'd been rejecting me since the beginning. "One chance," I finally whispered. "You get one chance to prove you mean what you're saying. But if you hurt me again, if you make me feel as worthless as I've felt these past months, I'm gone. Settlement or no settlement, I'll take this baby and build a life somewhere you can't destroy with your indecision." "I understand," Edward said solemnly. "And I promise I won't waste the opportunity you're giving me." The kiss he pressed to my forehead was gentle, almost reverent, and for the first time since our forced marriage began, I felt a tiny spark of hope that maybe we could forge something meaningful from the wreckage of our circumstances. It wouldn't be easy, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks and struggles ahead. But as Edward pulled me into an embrace that finally felt genuine, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps this story didn't have to end in disaster after all.